So here we are again, and tonight we thought we would look at some questions on the subject of personal happiness that it might be interesting to look at from a philosophic perspective. So it appears to me, and you may or may not agree with this, that the notion of personal happiness has changed over time, that the Greeks didn't look at it as the early Christians did, or either the one of them as we do. So maybe you could kind of look at it from a philosophic perspective and explain some of the iterations.
Well, I think the early Greeks, when you go back to Plato and Aristotle, and then to the Stoics and Epicureans, one of the central elements in practically all of their discussions of happiness, and really happiness was not a focus of their discussions. It was the good life. Happiness might result from living the good life, but it would not necessarily be the main focus of their attention. But virtue was a central element. Now, virtue is a tricky term, and it can mean different things to different people, as does the term happiness. Happiness itself is I believe, a subjective condition. There may be cultural surroundings that help us to form our views of what happiness might be. But I think in the early days, the Greeks were mainly concerned with virtue. They were concerned certainly with the Stoics and Epicureans. The Stoics were concerned with living in the world and accepting the world as it is. And that is what will bring you what we might call happiness, or at least peace of mind, if not happiness, and not troubling yourself about the things beyond your control. So if you, for example, were to read Epictetus, who is probably one of the most famous of the Stoics, his book, The Enchiridion, which I recommend to anyone interested in this subject. It's a short book. It's Enchiridion, I think, means handbook. But it basically says there are things that are within our power and things that are beyond our power, and we should not trouble ourselves with things that are beyond our power. Happiness will come, if you want to call it happiness, once we recognize this and we don't trouble ourselves with the things that we can do nothing about. The Epicureans, Epicurus, by the way, is listed both as an Epicurean and a Stoic, so he played both sides of the fence. But the general position that is given to the Epicureans is that they were not so much interested in the viewpoint that the Stoics had. They were interested in the avoidance of pain and fear. That a life that could avoid those would become a happy life.
Well, this is probably
they were not. I think the Epicureans get a bad press. I think they are generally expected to be fun-loving, sensuous people. Who
well, that was certainly always my view of them. I always
I know, and I think that
as big feasts and drinking wine.
Yes, that is an image of theirs, but frankly, the pleasures that they were really focusing on were the pleasures of the mind, not the body. So when they talk about pleasure being the end of life, it was more the pleasures of the mind and the body, although they do recognize that pleasures of the body are important, but they are not the main focus. As you march through the history of philosophy, I mean, if we skip over, much of the religious sections because those, I think, take a different philosophical view, and it's based on a supernatural set of propositions. You get into a whole variety of thoughts about the subject of happiness. You get the utilitarians who looked at pleasure and pain as the main focus of any ethical system. And when you read Jeremy Bentham, who is generally credited being one of the early proponents of utilitarianism, he said, all things being equal, poetry is as good as pushpin being a game of bowling. Pleasure itself was the measure of happiness, of the good. John Stuart Mill took issue with that and had a qualitative element introduced. So the qualitative element meant that pleasure in, again, the mind as opposed to the body would be an important focus.
Well, the Stoic philosophy appears to be much like some of the Eastern religions, which stress the notion of equanimity. Whether good things or bad things are happening, you want to have this steady state. And that seems to me to equate to what you're saying the Stoics are.
Yes, yes. Well, it is this connection with the natural world. What does the natural world present to us? And should we adapt to it rather than try to fight it or overcome it? The things that are beyond our power are what the natural world is made of. I mean, we cannot change the weather just because we want it to be different. We cannot undo the laws of nature. Therefore, a happy life would be one in which we recognize that and we adapt our behavior to it. I don't know that the Asian philosophies had quite the same view. They are, basically a non-Aristotelian, non-Platonic system. They don't have the same structures that Plato and Aristotle set up for the later Stoics and Epicureans, and even the pre-Socratics, who had views on the nature of reality, set a standard for Western culture and Western civilization that you don't find in the East.
Well, the central tenet of Buddhism, of course, is non-attachment. All pain comes from attaching to things and people and ideas. And so in order to achieve, well, maybe not giddy dancing in the street, but equanimity, is to have non-attachment.
Yes, well, there are those who say that the way to be happy is to be connected to less and less things. The less attachment you have to material goods, the greater the chance that your happiness will increase because you're not tied to all those material goods.
But it's not even a question of just material goods. It's opinions and attitudes, and it's more a question of acceptance of what happens. Now, of course, the objection to that is you have a passionless life, which just seems very bland. But I think they argue that that's not the case, that as you get into this, there's this rich, passionate intensity. But it's a difficult concept to wrap your arms around.
I don't think the Greeks had that view, and I don't think it carried through in the Western tradition. They're recognizing the necessity of living in the world, and the reality that has to be dealt with. It's just that if you spend too much time complaining and worrying about those things that are naturally occurring that you can do nothing about, or even not even just naturally occurring, but occurring through other political situations that you can't do anything about, then your chance of being happy starts to drop off. And if you tie yourself to too many pleasures of the body, the body deteriorates over time.
Yes.
So that happiness will not last a long time.
Well, now we were talking about, I mean, some modern day self-help gurus say that our central motivations are either pleasure or pain, as you were saying, that we want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And certainly in our world, that makes a lot of sense. But now, we're stepping out of Greco-Roman times, which were relatively civilized, and we're going into the deep Middle Ages where there's a lot of pain. And then we get into the Christian philosophers, and it's like, well, you're surrendering to the will of God, so no matter how bad it seems, you should be happy. Can you address some of the Christian philosophers?
Well, I mean, that is a different sense of happiness. I mean, if your happiness is, your expectation of happiness goes beyond your present condition. If you are to believe in an afterlife, for example, then all the pain that you go through in this life will be recompensed in a future life. And so that if you believe that that is where your happiness will ultimately reside, well, then you lead a very different sort of life. I'm not sure that that position it has extended into modern times, clearly, that people will struggle against the difficulties they face in life and will not simply hand it off to to a supernatural being to settle the question later on. But I don't know that personal happiness, in the sense that we tend to look at it today, was uppermost in the minds of the medieval philosophers. I mean, they were looking at the long term, and the long term was eternity. And therefore, if you suffer today, but the reward for your suffering is eternal happiness,
Well,
that's
it's like delayed gratification. I mean, yes, I mean, it's, but their aim was ultimate gratification.
well, yes, ultimately.
Um,
But I mean, what sort of happiness might that have been? It would not be, the kind of happiness that most people think of when they think of what makes me happy, money and fame and position.
but
And
are those just not modern constructs? I mean,
well,
what we're looking at here is people redefining happiness over history. I mean,
well,
what I'm hearing you say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is history is, I mean, happiness is a state of mind. You choose to be happy because of how you're defining it in your own mind. Is that, am I
well, I mean,
phrasing you correctly or not?
it is a subjective feeling. I mean, and it certainly is different from person to person. What makes one person happy does not necessarily make other people happy. Whether you have control over this is another matter. I mean, you can tell yourself that I will remain happy no matter what happens to me in the course of the day. But only you can say whether that's actually true. People, it is very common for people to put up a good front and claim to be happy when in fact they are not. And no amount of deciding to be happy, I don't think, can overcome what may be the forces that are operating on you.
I don't
Can
know.
you really decide to be happy just because you want to be? I mean, if that were the case,
Well, maybe
where would we be?
it becomes like an attitude. It becomes like habitual. And I've known some people who are extraordinarily disabled, and they were born that way. They're like in wheelchairs and whatnot from day one. And yet they have this wonderful attitude. And they certainly appear to be very content, whereas you or I might just think, oh, this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. And yeah, I don't know that I could work myself into a state of happiness. And yet I've seen people and who are much better people than are much better individuals than I am.
Well, you use the word,
Whatnot.
you use the word, they appear that way. And it may very well be the case that they have settled within themselves the expectation that life will bring them only so much, that they will not, be in the Olympics, and they will not run for president. And yet we have Franklin Roosevelt, who was disabled and he ran for president, and we have the Special Olympics for people who are not performing in the regular Olympics. And so we have modified the circumstances within which their happiness can show itself.
It's interesting that you mentioned Roosevelt because, as you know, he was a very robust man, and then he contracted polio as an adult after he had a very successful career. And being a man of means, his mother was saying, oh, well, Franklin, just retire to the estate and live a quiet life. Well, that's not what he wanted. And they always say the genius of Roosevelt was he had a superior psychology. And there's a wonderful anecdote. He walks into a bank and he's just, starting to walk with his crutches and whatnot with polio. And he collapses on the floor. I mean, which must have been very embarrassing and humiliating. But instead of crawling away, he just sits there and roars with laughter and says, get me up, get me up. And they get him up and he carries on. And they say that his genius was his superior psychology. So to me, he's defining happiness, at least for himself. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think this may leave the realm of philosophy and move into psychology, where you are not following any philosophical principle. You are simply saying, I make a determination within myself to ignore the difficulties in my life and to overcome them by strength of will, and to move on and to make the most of all the time I have.
But I
think we honor those people who do that.
But don't you think that all psychology basically flows from some philosophic outlook?
Well, I mean, that's how I got started. We moved from psychology into philosophy, but I don't know. There is a lot of research in psychology that points to physical activity of the brain that determines our attitudes and moods and how we feel. And the question then is that within our power to turn on and off? One would think it is not, because if it were, people would be a lot happier than they are for the most part. People whose lives are unhappy might be able to readjust their brain structure and say, well, okay, now I'm going to be happy, which they cannot do very easily. So there's a lot more to this, I think, than even psychology and philosophy together have been able to demonstrate. So, but I don't think as a philosophical position, for example, Epictetus, I believe it was Epictetus, was a slave, and the master was testing his theory about whether you could be, not unhappy no matter what the circumstances were, if they were beyond your control, and he proceeded to break one of his bones. At which point Epictetus was not crying out. So the story goes. I mean, we're talking about 2,500 years ago, and things may not be exactly accurate. But he was of the firm belief that, well, I have no control over this, and so why should I bemoan my fate? I mean, it's painful, no doubt, but I have no power to change that, and so I accept it. And but I don't know that that attitude is one that that he could sustain throughout his life. We don't know. My my guess is, yeah, because he's a human being like the rest of us, that he probably had his moments
Oh,
where,
I'm sure. I don't think anybody could ever have a completely happy life, but it's a question of returning to a certain center that brings contentment. And obviously, you know much more about this than I do, but isn't the Aristotelian model kind of like the golden mean? You
the
want to be in
golden
the
mean,
middle.
right?
That
Well,
seems
the
to me to
golden
make a lot of sense.
well, it makes a lot of sense unless you use some odd
Well, maybe you should
counter.
explain it a little more
Yeah, well,
fully.
the golden mean, nothing to excess. I mean, that was an expression that the Meidenagon, the Greeks had, that excessive behavior on either side of the spectrum was not what you should aspire to, but somehow you should find in the middle. Cowardice and foolhardiness are extremes. Bravery is in the middle, and so that was a virtue. Now, some of those who object to this view have raised, well, killing no one is one extreme, killing thousands is on the other. So killing 100 is okay, as the middle, as the mean between extremes. No, and that Aristotle would never accept such a thing. But yes, finding a middle ground, taking the position that at the extremes you are bound to run into trouble, is what he favored. And so the golden mean was a foundation of his ethical theory. And that's it makes a lot of sense, but he was not the only Greek to say that. That expression flows through much of Greek philosophy.
So is a sense of personal identity or identity within a group essential to happiness?
Well, some think so. Some take great pleasure and comfort in being a member of a group and feeling the camaraderie and the support that the group provides. But as a philosophical question, must I be in a group to realize myself, to experience that self-actualization that is often discussed in both psychology and philosophy? There are any number of examples of people who are loners and who are perfectly happy in that. I think it is certainly, we are social animals. We have been since we've been roaming the savannah, and we take comfort in that. And that would lead one to suppose that membership in a group is of value. The question is, which group? Which group do you want to be members of? And there, different values come into play.
Well, of course, you've got people like Nietzsche and more popularly Ayn Rand, suggesting that being a part of the group is an abdication of your true nature, that you're just becoming a sheep. And that, of course, they would suggest that happiness is in maximizing your ego.
Well, I don't know as much about Nietzsche as I do about Rand, but I know in Rand's book, in Atlas Shrugged, there was quite a group of people who formed Galt's Gulch and were perfectly happy with each other, because they had respect for one another. They
Right.
had respect for them as individuals who were producers, who were thinkers, who were creators, and that could be a group of people, um, each one an individual. And so there is a value on both ends of the spectrum there. I mean, they're valuing their individuality and their membership in a group of individuals who all recognize each other as individuals.
True, but they both seem to be rejecting the culture of the day.
Yes, well, certainly, sacrificing yourself for the good of the group, um, as a moral requirement, um, would be against Rand's position, for example, and probably Nietzsche as well. The that sense of virtue, where self-sacrifice is looked upon as a good thing, um, was foreign to them. And to that extent, if self-sacrifice on behalf of the group is what you mean by gaining a certain degree of happiness as being a member of the group, yes, we have more commonly had the view that it is a virtuous thing to sacrifice yourself on behalf of the group. We give out, medals of honor to the guy who falls on the grenade to save his buddies, at the sacrifice of his own life. If that were not considered a virtue, then this would not be done. Um, so, but membership in a group, I don't think, is a necessary condition of happiness. There are, as I said, people who seem perfectly happy and they're on their own.
Um, Abraham Maslow, of course, wrote the very well-known and popular hierarchy of needs. And of course, he starts out with, you have to have food and shelter, and then it builds up. And the ultimate need is self-actualization, which I guess you would equate with happiness in terms of whatever you would say self-actualization is. I mean, some people might find it in being an artist, some people might find it in being a philosopher, some people might find it in being whatever. It seems to me that celebrity culture, as we know it, kind of undermines the notion of self-actualization, because you are comparing yourself with this super idealized celebrity, and you might tend to diminish your own accomplishments. Now, this is kind of a long intro, but let me give you an example of what I mean. There were these tribes out in the Amazonian jungle, and they were very happy with what they did, and they were hunters, and they made their pots, and they were very content with their society until they came into contact with a more advanced society. And then they were very unhappy because they knew all of the things they did were kind of meaningless in terms of this wider, more glamorous Western culture. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, this has happened elsewhere. I think there are South Sea Islanders who also felt that the cargo culture that
Right.
arose down there was another example similar to this. You can bring to the attention of people what was not brought to their attention before and make them envious. I think that has happened in our society with the great expansion of communication methods. People can see lives of wealth and material possessions and feel that they are somehow at a loss because they don't have them, and they're not happy because they don't have them, when before they were made aware of them, they were perfectly happy. I mean, the same probably has happened to us. I mean, we rode around in the 50s in unair-conditioned cars, and none of us felt that that was a source of unhappiness as such. It is now. If your air conditioning goes out in your car, you're very unhappy. And it's only because you have now been exposed to something that you were not exposed to before.
No.
That seems to me to be perfectly reasonable. You raise the expectations of people. You tell them what is now possible, which they never knew was possible before. And then they become disappointed if they don't get it.
But I'm not sure it's just entirely in terms of material things. I mean, it's this craving, and of course the ancients craved fame and glory. I mean, the Trojan War is all about, reputation. And, we have people out there, they're perfectly happy to become infamous by doing bad things as long as they have a name.
Yes, yes. Well, I don't think the Greeks were trying to do things for the purpose of having a reputation. That they felt that this is what a person does. This is how a person acts. When you excel in battle, you don't do it because you're going to get a medal and a statue. You do it because you have been raised in a culture that says that is what a good person does. And the fact that you're rewarded afterwards with fame is not your main purpose. Today, that may not be true. Today, people will do things with the intention of getting to be famous because they feel that fame will give them other gifts that come right along with it. And they're not doing it for its own sake. The Kantian ethical theory is, do good not because of the consequences, but because it is good. Do good though the heavens fall. So there is that sense of the rightness of action that is independent of any comparison with someone in a celebrity status. We don't do some. I think people will say we do good deeds because they're good, and not because I want to be rewarded, and not because I want to be idolized by my fellows.
But do you think celebrity culture has distorted or perverted notions of personal happiness? Is it making people more unhappy, is what I'm asking.
Well, there's a wide spectrum of people and how they perceive their own lives, and whether they are satisfied with not being a celebrity and not being able to emulate a celebrity, but living a perfectly happy life independent of that. Those are the people I find to be the happiest. They're not dependent on the comparisons that are made with people in the news and people who have got great fame. They recognize that there is within their own lives opportunities to excel in ways that they find right and good.
Well, this is Maslow's I mean, there are people who are self-actualizing.
Yeah, they are. Well, and self-actualization, I mean, on one level, I think I mentioned before the Aristotle's concept of entelechy, the inner purpose of a thing. The acorn wants to be an oak tree, and each human being, and even each part of a human being, has a purpose, and the right way to express that is to let the purpose reach its full potential, and that's certainly what we would like. What I think people would be well advised to do with their own lives, to find their talents and express them. And not because they're going to get a pat on the back, but because it's what they want to do. It's a good thing to do.
Right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. And I think next time we'll continue on this topic. I have a lot more questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
All
Thank
right.
you, John.
Bye.
Take care.